Welcome to this insert in our series of valuations videos, more specifically our series of videos dealing with the valuation of derivative instruments. This is insert 3 of 4. During this specific insert, I'm going to be dealing with the valuation of forward agreements or forward contracts, more specifically then having a look individually at FECs or forward exchange contracts, which, as you know, is a currency mechanism, and thereafter having a look at forward rate agreements, which, as you also should remember from your risk management exposure, are interest rate instruments. What I'm going to do is start off by having a look at the FEC. Once we've done that, we'll have a look at the forward rate agreements. So let's reflect back on your journey through risk management and what you should have retained from that. So your embedded or presumed knowledge is that a forward exchange contract, or as we commonly refer to it in FEC, number one is an over-the-counter instrument. This contract or agreement is entered into between the two parties, between the two counterparties as we refer to them, and the agreement or contract is not a traded instrument. A foreign exchange future is the traded version of an FEC, but we're going to deal with futures separately later. Right, and so because it is not a traded instrument, the FEC doesn't have a market value. We are going to have to calculate a fair value for it. And that is the purpose then of this section. So what does this contract or agreement allow us to do? One of the two counterparties entering into the agreement is doing so normally to obtain a hedge. They want to hedge themselves against potential foreign exchange or currency risk, and so they would like to fix the exchange rate up front that will apply in future to their buying or selling a specific quantity of or amount of currency. And so that is precisely then what this counterparty then wishes to achieve through the agreement, is that the other counterparty to the agreement that they enter into agrees to fix up front the rate for the selling or buying by the other counterparty of this specified amount of currency on a specified future date. We're not going to have a look here at an option FEC, so we'll have a look at an FEC which only applies on a specific date, fixes in or locks in a rate, and that is how the hedge is created. By fixing or locking in that rate up front, the counterparty who is looking for a hedge is therefore no longer exposed to any currency movement. And so surely that is also where the value would be created or destroyed by this instrument, and that we'll talk to very, very shortly. So this rate fixed in or locked into the agreement up front, specified up front, is where the hedge then lies. Now, building on top of that, is from a valuations perspective, we need to question where the value creation or potentially value destruction. Remember, if the currency rates or foreign exchange rates don't move in the direction we anticipated, then we probably should never have hedged in the first place. And in a case like that, we will get that the FEC is a financial liability instead of a financial asset. But getting back to our central question, where does the value creation or destruction lie here? So, as soon as we've entered into an FEC, we as the one counterparty to the agreement, and we're going to be looking at our position here and valuing it from our perspective, wish to hedge ourselves against currency risk, and so we enter into this agreement or contract. And from that day onwards, that rate has been fixed for the settlement date somewhere in future. So beyond the date of entering into the FEC, one can very reasonably assume that should you have on any day thereafter have entered into an FEC for the same specified amount of Forex to buy or sell it at a rate that we're fixing up front, but for that same settlement or transaction date in future, you would more than likely enter into that at a different FEC rate. And so the value creation or destruction is really weighing up for the amount of Forex that you intend buying or selling at this fixed rate, how your rate that you've locked in differs from a rate that you would lock in at any measurement date or on valuation date thereafter. So remember, as the spot rates change from one day to the next, the forward rates that we project for a future date based on that spot would also be different. And that is what we want to place a value on. So it's very important takeaways here. Number one, it's for the same amount of Forex to either be bought or sold. So we're not changing our intention here. But we are weighing up the difference between the forward rates for the same settlement date. Why do they differ? It is because you would in essence be entering into a forward rate, a forward exchange contract, pardon me, an FEC, for the same settlement date, but entering into that contract on different dates. And so different forward rates would apply. And that's what we're going to place a value on. Now remember, the difference between these two rates relates to that future settlement date. And because that's lying in the future somewhere, this benefit or disadvantage is a future value. Now, for financial reporting purposes, especially where the hedge is short term, in other words, the contract applies for a period of 12 months or less, one might then argue that the time value of money implications here are insignificant and that one doesn't need to discount it. We are going to rather be consistent and will discount any FEC, no matter the term. So once I've determined what this value difference is at settlement, I need to present value it or discount it back to a present value and that will represent the fair value of the forward exchange contract or FEC. Now what's very important is, because we are hedging currency risk here and not interest rate risk, we are not going to look at an interest rate applicable at settlement date, because then part of the fair value would arise through the interest rates differing as well between valuation date and settlement date. And so all we want to focus on here is calculating a fair value for the currency risk portion here, for the hedging thereof through the FEC. And so we are going to use a spot rate, a spot interest rate on valuation date. So an appropriate benchmark rate depending on the time expiration or lapse between valuation date and settlement date. That would guide you as to which interest rate would be appropriate, and we are going to discount it at that rate. That then provides me with a fair value. Now, one last issue before we have a look then at the actual valuation of the instrument. Where you have, and typically in financial reporting terminology, if you've got a highly probable transaction that is taking place somewhere beyond the next year and you want to hedge that with an FEC, the interest rate is going to become an issue here. Where we're dealing with a short-term hedge, it is very easy. You will always default to discounting an N, a period of 1, and adjust the rate for the term of that period. With a single compounding taking place, where it's a medium-term instrument, then, as you should know from your financing exposure, more often than not, the interest rate in such a case doesn't compound once over that time, it compounds monthly. And so you could argue that in valuing on a fair value basis an FEC over a medium term, that you would need to compound on a monthly basis that interest rate, and then N would be the number of months between valuation date and your FEC settlement date, and not a period of one, as I said, which is what we're going to default to if it's a short-term instrument. So let's have a look then at an example. Benz SA is a South African motor car manufacturer that needs to import a specific component from a manufacturer in Europe. And so they enter into an order, they place an order and enter into a sales agreement with this German manufacturer, and they do that on 25 March 20x20 to purchase 10,000 components at a list price of 120 euros each. Now, on that day, on the 25th of May, the spot rate in the currency market between the rand and the euro, and remember this is a direct quote, is 19 rand 46.52 cents to 1 euro. So it's a direct quote. Delivery date for the components, and as well as settlement date for the amount owing to the trade creditor, is set for 30 September. Now the risk is between 25 May and 30 September, as your knowledge from risk management will tell you, there is a transaction risk from a currency risk perspective. And so the hedging policy of Benz SA requires that if that exists, that the company hedges against it. And so in terms of the hedging policy, the treasurer, the head of the treasury at Benz SA on 25 May enters into an FEC for settlement on 30 September, and very, very important, locks in a rate of 20 Rand 44.22. So let's just, there is the rate that we've locked in, and that is going to be one of the key inputs into the valuation always. Now, let's read the last paragraph or sentence and see what that tells us. The 3-month JIBAR on valuation date. Now, what could valuation date be? Valuation date number 1 could be in terms of an acquisition. You're acquiring shares in Benz SA that you need to value. You need to value this FEC just like you would any dissimilar asset. And so valuation date there would be the valuation for the acquisition. But very importantly, because we're dealing with financial assets or liabilities, when we look to the derivative instruments, valuation date will more often than not be the year end or the interim reporting date. In other words, the financial reporting dates of the company. And so here we're going to assume, because there's nothing else mentioned here, that it is on a reporting date that the valuation is being done, which is 30 June. So 3-month JIBAR for 30 June is 4.08%. What is the relevance of that? That is the discount rate. Now, on measurement date, on valuation date here, if I on that day was to enter into an FEC for settlement on 30 September, now what's the relevance of that? That is the same date as we have specified in the FEC that we want to value. That's critical here. So for the same date as that set in our FEC that we want to value, if we entered into an FEC now on measurement date, being reporting date, we could fix in or lock in an FEC rate of 20 Rand 61.84 cents. So the question that I want to ask you then, or the statement that I'd like to make, is, are we not in essence valuing the difference between those two rates there as it applies to the euro value of those 10,000 units? Now what I've done for you is I've gone and pre-populated, so you'll see all the detail there. Don't be scared, I will explain it to you now. But let us now go and value this forward exchange contract together. So the first thing we need to do is we need to determine what the euro value is that we are hedging. The euros in this case that we are going to buy and that need to be settled on 30 September. The first thing, we are purchasing 10,000 units of the component at 120 euros each, and so we are hedging 1.2 million euros for settlement on 30 September. Now, where does the value lie? The value lies in the difference between the 20 Rand 44.22 cents locked in on 25 May, and very easy, what I would have locked in as an FEC rate for the same settlement date, 30 September, but when? On measurement date. And measurement date is valuation date here, which is 30 June. And so there we would have locked in a rate of 20 Rand 61.84. So we determine that a 17.62 South African cents per euro benefit arises, that we need to apply to the 1.2 million euros, and it gives me 211,440 South African rands. But remember, when is that the benefit? That is on settlement date. It relates to settlement date. So that benefit in essence is a future value at 30 September. I now need to discount that. So what I want you to ask yourself here is this a short-term hedge, or do we see it from a time value of money perspective as being medium-term? Because then we will deal with it differently in terms of the discounting. Now, from 30 June to 30 September is definitely a short-term period, and so we know as soon as we discount anything over the short term, we normally would discount a period of 1. So a single compounding. Now, as I said to you, when you measure the value, the fair value here, we're going to always apply a rate, an interest rate here being the spot interest rate, and not, please, a forward rate for 30 September. We are not valuing an interest rate derivative here, where part of the value arises from the interest rates changing. This is solely the currencies that differ. So using a spot benchmark rate, we'll use the 3-month JIBAR here, which makes total sense because the period to settlement is 3 months. Now, because that's an annual rate and we are valuing a 3-month period, we need to set the number of P per year to 4, and I now go and say the future value is that 211,440. So let's go and open up in Excel. The rate is that 4,08, but I now need to set Excel, just like you do your financial calculator, to 4 periods per year. We are valuing this over 1 quarter, and we said that's 1 period, and that gives me, with a future value of 211,440, it gives me a fair value, let's just change the sign, of 209,305 Rand and 9 cents. Very, very crucial here, that value, would you recognize that as a financial asset or a financial liability? Now, because the FEC rate that we locked in here for what we're buying is more favorable, this is a financial asset. Right. Easy. Yep. And now for the second half, and there we're going to have a look at a forward rate agreement. Now let's go back and reflect on what you should know from your exposure during our risk management series this year, and that is that a forward rate agreement is an interest rate derivative. We are hedging a change in interest rates using this contract, but what does the agreement entail? Now the problem that we have is where we want to borrow, and obviously with the borrowing there would be an interest rate applicable, or we want to invest in an interest-bearing investment in future, or borrow in future, there is interest rate risk between today and the borrowing or investment agreement being entered into with the bank that we're borrowing from or the investee that we are investing into. And so we want to hedge against that risk, and we do that through entering into a separate agreement. The FRA is a separate agreement that we enter into with a counterparty, in terms of which we are locking in a rate in advance for the date on which, and this is important please, for the date on which we plan on borrowing or investing. Now remember, you cannot do that through the investment agreement or the borrowing or lending agreement with the bank, because we are not physically borrowing or investing yet. And so what we're doing is this derivative mimics that up front or in advance. And so what we're going to do is this agreement will have to activate, become functional or effective on the date on which you would borrow or invest, and to hedge ourselves properly needs to cover the same period as the borrowing or investment would cover. So on the inception date of the agreement, not the date we enter into it, but the date on which it becomes effective, we are fixing in a rate that we call the forward rate. So we're locking that in. Now what happens to that forward rate? On inception date, or the day on which this agreement takes effect, the two counterparties measure the difference between that rate locked in, known as the FRA rate, and the reference rate. In other words, the rate that we need to compare that rate to or against, which would normally be a specified JI bar, because these are normally short-term arrangements. So we would determine with reference to that rate then whether the rate built in or locked in is beneficial to us. So if we are hedging interest rate increases as a borrower, we are scared of interest rate risk, and interest rates do increase beyond that locked in rate, then we receive a cash settlement. But should interest rate risk not arise as we expected, in fact that interest rates have not moved or may be reduced, then the counterparty needs to receive the cash settlement. But what's very important is the difference between these two rates applies to the entire term of that agreement. Now the problem that you have is, in essence, you should only be entitled to that difference at the end of the term. But here comes the value creating determinant. in a forward rate agreement. The forward rate agreement will always specify that cash settlement of the agreement needs to take place on the day on which the agreement takes effect. Not the day you enter into it, but the day on which it takes effect. Now, because of that, we are going to go and determine then the difference between these two rates and apply them to the value being hedged, which we call the notional value. That difference in the rates is applied to that, and we then need to discount that to a present value on the date on which the agreement takes effect, because that represents the cash settlement. So when we do a valuation here, surely number one, that is what we need to calculate, because that is the value created at that date by the agreement. Now the problem is, at the point of measuring a fair value for this agreement, that inception date or effective date on which the agreement becomes effective has not been reached yet. And so we're not going to be able to deal with the spot interest rate for the reference rate. We will have to deal with a forward rate for that reference interest rate on that date, and then apply that. The problem is, measurement or valuation date precedes that date. So that benefit or loss, if the rates didn't move as we anticipated, lies in the future. It's a future value, and hence we're going to have to discount it back. Now, at what rate do we discount it back? No risk has been adjusted for in terms of defining or determining the cash benefit. And so we are going to factor in risk here through the discount rate. And so when we present value or discount that benefit or loss resulting from on the date that the agreement becomes effective, resulting from a difference in the interest rates on that day, we need to discount it back at a risk-adjusted rate, and the rate we're going to take is the forward rate agreement will be subject to an ISDA, or an International Standard Derivative Agreement. And in an annexure to that agreement, the counterparties will specify what the rate is that will apply for any credit support being extended here through the agreement. And so in theory, we are going to use that rate. The rate in the annexure specified for credit support, which will be a number of basis points in excess of normally the reference rate. If we used the 3-month JIBAR as a benchmark, we would take the rate on valuation date or measurement date for the 3-month JIBAR and adjust it slightly upwards for that credit support premium, which will be a number of points in excess of JIBAR. That we use as the discount rate here. Now let's read through the example. Fashionista is a large listed retailer in South Africa with a financial year end being 30 July. Now the management of Fashionista plans on borrowing 80 million rand on 1 October, and obviously we are going to be standing at a date before that here if we are going to enter into an FRA. The borrowing, the term of it will be 3 months. Now this is crucial, because what we need to do is to ensure then that our forward rate agreement covers the same term, and that is a 3-month term which terminates or ends on 31 December. Right, so the rationale here, why do we want to hedge? There are indications in the market that interest rates are going to increase, and so before we can enter into the borrowing agreement with the bank and fix in a rate, we then here have to hedge using an alternative mechanism, and that would be through a forward rate agreement entered into in advance of 1 October to fix in an interest rate through the agreement. And so, very, very important here is on 15 July. Now that date is going to be important in us considering what the value is, because 15 July is in advance of the year end. So by year end, this company has an FRA in place, and that is the rationale here for doing the valuation. Now, right, and so in fact we enter then into that 3-month FRA, which expires on the same day that the borrowing will be repaid of 31 December. And an FRA rate, which is built in or locked into the agreement, is set at 7.5%. Now that's important because that is the one rate that we're going to use in determining whether a benefit or a loss exists here. Now on 31 July, the JIBAR for fixing a rate on 1 October is now 7.75%. So remember, we haven't reached 1 October yet, and so we're going to be dealing with forward interest rates here. But we need on valuation date to identify what the equivalent rate would be then. If we were to fix in a rate on 1 October, that is the reference rate that we're going to compare then our forward rate agreement rate of 7.5% with. Don't forget, when we apply that difference in the interest rates to the 80 million rand notional value, it is a future value that will need to be discounted to 1 October, which is cash settlement date, and then discounted again from there. Now, what rate do we use to do the discounting there? As I mentioned to you earlier, we look at the credit support annex to the ISDA agreement, which the FRA is subject to, and we find there that 10 basis points have been identified as the premium on top of the 3-month JIBAR, which would apply to any credit support being extended. And remember, those 10 basis points indicate the risk here. And that is why for a risk-adjusted rate, we would adjust by those 10 basis points. On 31 July, the prevailing 3-month JIBAR is 7.3%, and so that is the start of what we need to calculate a discount rate. We are going to do a fair value calculation here on 31 July for financial reporting purposes. Now, I thought it might be useful before we go and do the calculations to draw a timeline of on what dates what is happening here. So, Fashionista enters into the forward rate agreement with the counterparty on 15 July. Other than contracting, nothing happens on that day. The inception date, or the date on which the agreement becomes effective, is 1 October. So that is the date when I need to go and determine the present value of that benefit or loss arising from the forward rate agreement, and it is on that date on which cash settlement of that benefit would occur. So that is an instrumental date in the valuation here, in the fair valuing of the FRA. Now the problem is that date lies beyond valuation date, and so on valuation date I need to PV that difference to a fair value on 31 July. Now, what I'd like you to do is to get your paper out, and I'm going to work through this example with you. So let's start off by indicating what the nominal or notional amount is of the forward rate agreement. And we know that that is the 80 million rand, which we intend on borrowing. Right. Now, the next thing I'd like to build in here is what is the forward rate that we have locked into the agreement. You're right, it's 7.5%. Now, what do we need to compare that with? We need, on valuation date, to look at what the equivalent rate for fixing an interest rate on 1 October would be. And that is that 7.75%. And so what do we find here? We find that we have a benefit arising, and that benefit is the 0.25% per annum, by which that equivalent rate for 1 October exceeds the forward rate. We now apply that to the notional amount to get the rand benefit. So it's 80 million times the 0.25%, but that rate is per annum. So we need to adjust it for the 3 months that it applies to. And that gives me a 50,000 Rand benefit. Now that benefit is what we get when we base the calculation on months. The more accurate version would probably be to work on the number of days rather. So on a day convention, a day count convention, how many days would that be? So we've got 31 days in October, 30 days in November, and 31 in December. So we have a total of 92 days. So I could probably, it would be more accurate rather to take that 0.25% per annum times the 80 million Rand times 92 over 365 or 360 depending on the day count that you use, and that gives me a benefit of 50,410 Rand and 96 cents. And I'm going to show you that in yellow because that is the one figure that we are going to have to work with shortly. When is that the value? That is the value on 1 October. Or we need a value for it on 1 October. This benefit arises over the term, over the 3 months or the 92 days. And so unless it was stipulated, and as I said to you earlier, every FRA would do that, that it is cash settled on day 1, you would need to PV this. But because of that requirement that it be cash settled, we will always present value that amount. Right, and so just to remind you, please, this 50,410 Rand 96 cents is a future value. It accrues over time, and so the company would only actually be entitled to that benefit on 31 December. But because of the requirement that the benefit or loss be cash settled on day 1 of the FRA, we now need to discount that 50,410 Rand back to a PV on day 1 of the agreement. So this again is a short-term instrument, and so we are going to go and discount it using an N of 1. And so the first thing we need to do is I need to remember that the number of days involved here is 92 days. So I'm going to take my rate per year and I'm going to adjust it. So what is the discount rate? We need to take as a reasonable rate that's 7.75%, which is the rate that we compared the FRA rate to on 1 October, and to adjust that for the 92 days that the period represents of 365. And I get a rate then for the 92-day period. Now I can work with an N of 1. Remember, when we discount short term, anything over the short term, we normally only compound once. We know our future value is that 50,410 Rand 96. And so I now calculate a PV on, very important, 1 October of that benefit. So I'm going to open up my formulas here. You go to your financial calculator. So our rate is that 1.95%. We've already adjusted it to that portion of the year. We are discounting it with 1 compounding, in other words, an N of 1, a future value of 50,410 Rand 96, and that gives me a value, let's just change the sign, on 1 October of 49,445. Now remember, we need a value on 31 July. So how are we going to determine that value? I need to know what the credit support premium that is applicable on top of the 3-month JIBAR here would be. And we know that is the 10 basis points at the bottom there. And we know that the 3-month JIBAR on valuation date is that 7.3%. And so what do I do next? I now get my risk-adjusted rate. And to get the risk-adjusted rate, we take the 7.3%, we add on the credit support of 10 basis points or 0.1%, and we get a rate of 7.4% here. Now this is the discount rate at which I discount that PV then from 1 October, the cash settled amount, to a fair value on 31 July of being the financial year end. Now 1 October versus 31 July, how many days is it? The day count, so let me just do that for you. The day count, we have 31 days in August, 30 in September, and that 1 day into October then. So we have a 62-day count. So the risk-adjusted rate for 62 days, I would start off, and we're working here on a 365-day year. Some of the banks might work on a 360-day year, so please always just read carefully. If nothing is said, work with 365. So there is our risk-adjusted rate. Now, again, this is short term, so we use a period of 1, in other words, only 1 compounding. We've got our I for that specific period. We know that the future value is the 1 October value, which is that there, and I now go and PV that to get the fair value. So let me open up. You go to your calculator. I will open up my Excel here. So the rate is 1.26% for those 62 days. We are going to have 1 compounding. The future value is the 49,445, and that gives me a value of 48,831. What would you classify this as? A financial asset or a financial liability? In this case, it would be classified as a financial asset because we are entitled to receive this because it is a benefit. And so that cash settlement then, the benefit on 31 July, the fair value of that is 48,831 Rand and 28 cents. All that's left for me to do is to say thank you for listening and paying attention, and I trust that you have a very clear idea of how we value two very different kinds of forward contracts. Remember, they are inherently different given that the FEC is a currency hedge while our FRA is an interest rate hedge. But thank you once again.